There's 56 fucking.
Alrighty, good morning, everyone. It is 11 on the dot, and let's get started here this morning. What I would like to do at the outset is give you just a little bit of feedback on the discussions, the tweets that I've taken a look through, and then we will continue population and broadening that discussion, seeing how time, but I think we should be able to get that discussion also squared away for how that impacts agriculture as well. So here we go, let's get started. I wanted to just put up on the screen, I just took a random selection of 6 tweets that I liked. I liked a lot of them. I think all of you are on track here for sure. Just one note, I know there may have been some confusion, but in the syllabus, and as I said, on Zoom, everyone, the tweets need to be 280 characters, right? I got a few mini essays. I haven't graded you off for any of those mini essays, but they need to be 280 characters, right? A character is a letter and a space. So keep them short and punchy, right? But let me share a few from you. I've taken out your last names, but here's one from Adam that I liked. We are the caretakers of this earth, so it's time to start acting like it. Being an environmental steward does not mean that you have to live a perfect zero waste life using no plastic or fossil fuels. Instead, we should all just start trying to be more conscious about our actions and how they affect the planet that we live on. Take shorter showers, use reusable containers, eat less food, pick up any trash you see. It's not easy to be selfless and care about the earth more than ourselves, but just putting the foot forward is the key to winning the race. Adam, I don't know who you are, but thoughtful, right? And I agree completely with you there. It's not that, and we'll I hope that at the end of this course, you will get a sense, but just my opinion, we all have such an impact on the planet, right? We get to vote with our wallets every day. Everything we do impacts the environment, whether, whatever we buy from the store, how much gas we put in our car, it all impacts the environment. So it's not that it's good or bad, it is what it is. And I thought that was really good, really thoughtful. From Austin, the shocking realization that 825 million people are underfed and every 5 seconds a child dies of hunger is something we must take more seriously as a country. With an abundance of resources, how can we come together and help our brothers and sisters in impoverished countries? It's another thoughtful one. Yeah, it's another theme in this class, right? This management of the commons and the greater good. Who is willing to pay whatever that price is, right? It may not be in dollars amounts, to manage the commons and for the greater good. From Brooke, to combat the hashtag Anthropocene era, we must champion sustainability and reduce our carbon footprint. I completely agree. The consequences of climate change cannot be reversed, but they can be slowed. The climatic implications are extensive, so we must focus on sourcing foods locally, preserving natural habitats, and limiting waste. Again, that's a very thoughtful and pragmatic discussion and tweet. There's this, we live in a world of extremes, right? And you all know, just as well as I do, we live in a world of polarization. And the environment, while some people want to be extreme at either end of the pole, I think your tweet here, Brooke, moves along that middle ground that I tend to agree with, right? As you will see a little later on, I think we are undoubtedly committed to a warmer world by another 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. It's almost impossible now to reverse that, all right? And part of the implication is what we're going to talk about in a bit when it comes to global populations. Here's one from CJ. When thinking about the environmental issues going into the first lecture of Anthropocene stewardship, I did not realize how significant land degradation has been and how much land this issue has affected. I never considered how the issue is a direct parallel to the issue of global poverty. Yeah, again, great. A lot of people don't think about the interconnectedness of issues, and that's part of the goal of this course. Here's one from Cameron. This week we talked about putting a value on nature, seeing it if it's truly worth anything, which opened up a moral conversation. I honestly think there is nothing more valuable than the earth we live on, and that corporations have a moral obligation to, at the very least, assist in replenishing the resources they diminish. Yeah, I agree. Nice tweet. And then finally, just one from Clayton. Regarding the question, can you put a price on nature? The lecture changed my point of view. Well, Clayton, I'm glad. Previously, I had not given much thought to the value of nature except for the monetary value. The discussion in class allowed me to think of nature as something other than a commodity. So that's just, and again, I looked through them all, and those are just, I could have chosen any number, and I'll try and mix it up as we go through. But that's the kind of thoughtful, critical thinking, reflective type writing I'd like to see in the tweet. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions, comments, thoughts before we move forward.
So whenever you're like trying to figure out how many characters there are you, whenever we put it into Word, are you looking for the one that has with no spaces or with spaces?
Oh, good question. Gavin, I don't mind.
Okay.
Honestly, yeah, I really don't mind. Spaces, no spaces, that'll add 10 or 20. But if it's 2 pages, then it's tricky. So yeah, 280, you can do either spaces or no spaces. Thanks for that. I should have clarified.
If we're cutting it close and we're a couple over, is that okay? Or do you really want us to like push it under 280?
It's 2 letter grades per character. No, not at all. No. Again, some flexibility, all good. But if it's 260, 270, 280, that's fine. 290, but not 600. That's the goal, is to begin to help you distill those thoughts down into something short. All good. All right, great, everyone. Let's move on. Okay, so we continue here with population, and we now broaden out the discussion going beyond birth rates and death rates to look at how this applies globally, right? So we move into the field of demographics here and look at various countries, always keeping an eye on how this plays out in terms of the environment, right? So here's the starting point. We've gone through this. So we have been again, remarkably successful species. And the 20th century is the century of growth, right? You can see in 1910, there's about 1.8 billion people on the planet. 1960, there's 3 billion. 1964, I come along at 3.3 billion. Here we are. We go through the 7 billion mark in 2011. 2020, towards the end of 2020, we're at 7.7. We're right at about 7.8, just through 7.8 billion, depending on which statistic you look at. So that's been an incredible success story. Exactly where we are on that growth curve, we don't know. That's a bit of an open-ended question, and one that we'll continue to explore. So the other bubbles here are projections, and that's what I'm going to spend a lot of this morning talking about, is where are we headed, right? Where is population going, and where is it relative to this magical carrying capacity, okay? So the latest estimates put population at about 9.7 billion, right, by 2050. And we'll examine what may nudge that up and what may pull that back. But that, I think, is a very realistic estimate as to where we're going to be in another 30 years. Okay? In other words, we have another 2 billion people coming along, right? The same amount that was on the planet in 1940, more or less. So I think that's a pretty extraordinary statement, and obviously has some pretty large resource environmental implications. Moving out another 50 years to 2100, I think the current estimates, and we'll look at those in just a little bit, put it at about 10.9 billion, right? So no matter what we do, and I'll explain why as we go through this, we are committed to at least another 2 billion people on the planet. So just some images on ways to look at this. So this is the population in 1960. This is a graphic from National Geographic. And the countries here are sized according to their population. And each one of these little white dots represents 2 million people. So I'll just go backwards and forwards. And the reason I've got 2011 here is that was when we crossed the 7 billion threshold. So there's 1960, right? There's 2011. So I'll just go back a second. You look at places in Europe and the United States, yes, there's growth, but the growth doesn't come close to what's going on in Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. China, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Pakistan, and so on, right? So there has been extraordinary growth over that 50-year period, and that growth will continue. Another way to look at it, right, is population density. Okay, so this shows the number of people per square kilometer. Okay, so obviously you look at, places like Canada. Canada has a population of about 25 million people, and yet it's the second largest country in the world. Again, you look at places like India and China, that is a very different picture. Okay, so let me take a look at questions here. All right, from Charlotte. There are no stupid questions, Charlotte. So how come the population is rising so rapidly when medicine has made it so that people have fewer children? So that's not a stupid question. That's a great question. And hang on to that one, Charlotte, because we're going to come back to that in just a little bit. Okay, let me not preempt that question, but we'll get there. And tied up in your question is why we are already committed to another 2 billion, right? And let's see what else there is. Courtney, you put your hand up there. Give us a shout.
I was just wondering if there's a measure of how much the Earth's temperature increases per either million or billion people, like how much heat people are putting off, and how does that increase the Earth's temperature?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. You know what? Let me make a note of that. There is, so we're going to deal with that more specifically when we get to climate change, and we're going to talk about correlation and causation. But let me come back to you on that. Not this morning. Just hold off on that. But there is. But it's much more nuanced than that, right? It's not just simply more people, higher temperature, because there's a lot of other variables that go in there. But that's quite an interesting question. Sorry, I'm not trying to sidestep your question, but we'll get there. Okay, just another kind of setting the scene. Think about this. When you look at the current global populations, there are more people living inside this circle than out of it, right? So there is clearly a difference here in pressure on the land. And this is, very interlinked in terms of air quality. So we're going to look at that. We're going to tie this into biodiversity. There's a lot of issues in this course that are linked into this diagram. But I just want to plant this out there and show you this, that this is one of those graphics that always makes me go, huh, okay, pretty impressive. All right. So as we begin to move through this, and I'm going to go back to that question that Charlotte asked earlier on in the chat, right, about medicine causing people to have fewer children, yet the population is growing. So let's explore this a little bit. So this is a key demographic statistic here, right, is the TFR. So let's explore TFR for a second here and why this is so important. So the TFR is the total fertility rate. Okay, this is the number of babies per couple. Okay, and this is the key line here. This is the replacement fertility rate, and the replacement fertility rate is 2.1. Okay, in other words, what that means, everybody, is that for a population to simply replace itself, right, that population, each couple should have 2.1 children per couple. Now, why is it 2.1 and not 2? Surely it's 2, but it's not. Why is it not? Any thoughts?
There are single people.
Okay. Yep.
More women have jobs now and like careers.
So, okay, so that's an interesting one, Alicia. So that is, let's park that for a second because we're going to come back and look at that. This is, we're looking at this is a bit more conceptually. We're looking at a population, and for a population to, let's not worry about what's going on currently in the world, because that is an interesting one. We're going to examine that, but just for a population to replace itself, right? Whether they take the economy out of it, all of that, it's 2.1 and not 2, and that's because some people choose not to have kids, right? Some people cannot. There's also this demographic index, it's a tragic one, of course, which is infant mortality, IM, right? So there is infant deaths. So the reality is, for a population to replace itself, each couple has to have 2.1 children. Now this diagram is really important because this is the diagram and this is the index, the total fertility rate. This is the diagram that ultimately is going to drive global growth. So in 1950, just beyond 1950, the total fertility rate of the world's population was 4.95 on average. Each couple were having almost 5 kids on average, right? That's an extraordinary growth rate, okay? In 2019, 2020-ish, total fertility rates, well, they've now fallen below 2.5. But you can see there has been this 50% decline in the total fertility rates over the last 60 years, okay? And the projections are that we're going to be at a replacement rate globally of about 2.1 somewhere in the late 2030s to 2040s, okay? And that by 2100, global fertility rates will be below 2.1. And if the TFR is below 2.1, it means the population is shrinking. So any rate above 2.1 means the population is growing. Anything below that means it is shrinking. Does that make sense to everybody? Anybody got a question on total fertility rates? And the key with population growth is just how sensitive growth is to a half a person above that or a half a person below that, right? So that's the good news. The good news is that total fertility rates have been dropping, and in many parts of the world have been dropping precipitously. So what are the latest projections going out to 2100, right? So the latest projections from the United Nations, the World Bank, and various organizations, remember we said that we're looking at, so we're currently at 7.7-ish, 7.8, right, billion people. And the current projections are that we're going to add another 3.2 billion people by 2100 to make it 10.9 billion at the end of this century. That's where the consensus is in terms of the demographic models, what people are thinking, right? Does that make sense? So 3.2 billion people are very likely to come along, but look at this extraordinary statistic here. The vast majority of that, right, 2.7 billion, 85% of that growth is going to come from sub-Saharan Africa, okay? And another way to look at that, I've tried to sort of show this graphically here. When we look at the global growth in population, so this is the world's population in 1950 here on the left. The solid circle represents the 1950 population, right? So you can see in 1950, the population of North America was 173 million people. The projection is that by 2100, we'll be at 491. And that's the lightly shaded circle on the outside of that, right? So it's not that populations in Latin America and North America and Oceania, which includes Australia and New Zealand, they're not growing, but look at this, right? The difference between the population in 1950 and 2100 in Africa, 228 million to 4.3 billion, okay? Same as Asia, 1.4 billion to 4.7 billion, right? Europe is essentially flat. There's a little bit of growth, but not very much at all, okay? So why, what's important about this diagram? Why do we need to stop and think about the implications of this diagram, do you think? What should be of concern on a diagram like this, everybody? What comes to mind, do you think?
It's disproportionate.
So it's disproportionate. Was that Nolan?
Yes.
Okay, take it a step further. It's disproportionate, and therefore what?
Just the overall mass of the the circles that are displayed at various regions of the world. They're just disproportionate in size.
Okay, what are the implications of that, do you think?
Will
Right?
we run out of resources?
Say that again.
Will we run out of resources?
Okay, so resources. So talk a little bit more about that. Is that Hallie?
Yes, it's Hallie.
Cool.
Well, if there's more people on the planet, we need to create and have more resources to sustain life. And it can sometimes be difficult to find resources to do that.
Okay, so would you say that, now this is a generalization, so would you say that people in Africa are constrained in terms of resources or not?
I don't know.
Okay,
It reminds me, I think when you said, I think last lecture about like having more kids in order to get more resources because they're an asset instead of an expense. So that's like why they would grow more.
okay, good point, right? Good
I feel
point.
like a
There is
lot of
a,
it has to do with the certain cultures that everyone's in. In American culture, as you said, in the 50s, it was the baby boom era and whatnot. So there was a lot of people having children, and now it's starting to slow down. I'm an only child, and there's a lot of lesser populated households, I guess you could say. And then if you look to Africa and other places like around the world, like you just mentioned Africa, so China, they're starting to limit the children and whatnot, is at least in like the 90s and 2000s. I don't know if it's still in effect, but they used to have that law where you could only have one, unless you had twins or something like that. But
right,
you know,
okay, so yeah, so it's not in effect, and we'll explore that in just a little bit, right? But those are really good points, Nolan. You know, there's a global culture and individual cultures, right? And that's not that, this is no judgment at all. We're not making any judgment on which culture is better or worse, but nothing to do with that. It is what it is, right? There's something to be said for having big families and for bigger families to look after older parents and, you know, all things like that, as opposed to, you know, development and people moving into fully industrialized countries, technologically advanced countries, and on and on and on. People now have smaller families. Charlotte, you got a question? Fire away.
I just had something to contribute actually to the discussion. I wanted to like say about the culture thing that I think that even though Africa's population is growing faster than most of the other populations, that it is also decreasing compared to the years prior. Because for example, my grandparents had over 10 children, but their children, most of them had under 5 children.
Right.
And although the population keeps growing in that particular region, to the compared to the generations before them, it's actually decreasing.
So that's a really great point, right? Thank you for that. May I ask where your family is from originally?
I am from Rwanda.
Oh, awesome. I'm sorry I haven't been there. I hear wonderful things about Rwanda, right? So that's a really good point, right? Yeah, we can't lose sight. So this is overall numbers, and then you look at the rate at which populations are changing. You'll see some remarkable things in just a minute about some other African countries, right? On how rapidly the relative growth rate is coming down, because she's absolutely right. The total fertility rates are now well below 3 in many countries in Africa and dropping precipitously. The challenge is we've still got a large base of young people that are going to move into the reproductive years, and that is inevitably going to drive population growth moving down the line. I'm always just so thankful when people from other parts of the world chip in and give their viewpoint. So thank you for that. Courtney?
I'm taking a human parasitology class. And so what's interesting about this area of growth is that it's near the equator where there's neglected tropical diseases. And so it's interesting to see such growth in areas that host such a variety of, it's interesting just to see that even though these diseases are very prevalent near the equator, that there's also massive growth there as well that kind of is, a little contradicting as to the, I guess, in understanding the severity of like tropical diseases in this area, because even in like Latin America and Africa, those are all near the equator where these diseases are more prevalent. So I think it's very interesting to look at this from a disease perspective and see that these areas are still growing exponentially, even with these neglected tropical diseases.
So that's an interesting one. And, you know, yeah, I love these curveball questions. So I'm not qualified to talk about tropical diseases at all. But that's an interesting perspective. Are you suggesting that that modern medicine is sort of tie in the disease and the mortality aspect just a little bit for another minute?
I think what I'm learning and what I have been learning in my human parasitology class is that these diseases are under recognized. And
Oh,
so
right.
they're very under-recognized and undertreated. And so the counts for them are off, which would suggest that more people have these diseases and the morbidity rate is higher than what's suggested. But this is showing a contrary perspective where the diseases aren't as severe as they are because the population is still growing so much. So there's a bit of, it's interesting to see in one class where, you know, they're talking about diseases and these very specific areas are just kind of running rampant with no proper documentation, but yet the population in those areas is increasing.
Yeah, I think it's very nuanced, right? Lee, do you have, thanks for that. Lee, do you have a question? I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, I think there will be more constraint on resource in Africa than in America because there's more people there.
Yeah, so thanks for reminding me to come back to the resource question, right? As you'll see, and there's really a series of dominoes in this class. It's so interconnected. When we start talking about energy, if I can get off this slide in the next month, when we start talking about energy, you'll see that, you know, we get our energy and our electricity all from different things, right? We're in the developed world, and for us, I don't know about you, but when I turn on the switch on the wall, electricity magically turns on above my head. For a large proportion of people in Africa, they still get their energy from biomass, burning wood, right? So why should we be concerned about that? Well, that is a resource-constrained environment where they're still, you know, they're cutting down trees for survival. So it's a very important theme, the inequity in the distribution of resource and the distribution of people. Interesting comments. So this is what the world's most populous countries will look like, right? In 2100, India will become the most populous country by 2100. That's almost certain. China's population will actually be less in 2100 than it currently are. You can see Nigeria, the US, and the other ones are laid out there. So there's the top 10, right, in 2100. And this is another way that I thought might be sort of quite interesting to portray this. So this diagram here shows the population of the top 15 countries in 2019 on the left-hand side here. So here's 2019, right? The projection in 2050 and the projection in 2100, with the arrow showing, you know, showing up or down. So China will be the second most populous country, which will change with India. And then in the next 50 years, these top 5 will essentially remain unchanged. So there's going to be some pretty dramatic changes here in the next 30 years, right? Look at Nigeria here from number 7, will go up to number 3 and stay number 3, right? If you go down here, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, goes from 67 to 9, okay, up to 6. Think about managing resources when you have a population from 67 to 362, right? I'm not a great mathematician, but that's about 10 times the population, right, in growth, and the issues that are going to be faced there, as opposed to the issues, and I think this is often overlooked. Look at the Russian Federation, right? These down arrows are showing population declines, okay? Look at Bangladesh, for example, 193 million people in 2050. That's going to go down to about 151 in 2100. It's an interesting way, I think, to look at the change in demographics and what that might mean. Here's the caveat, everybody. The caveat is that all of these projections are dependent upon the total fertility and R, the growth rate. Remember our friend R, birth rate minus death rate, right? How does the birth rate minus the death rate play out in terms of population growth? Remember, a population growing at 10% has a doubling time of 7 years, right? So these projections are based on the total growth rate over the next 30 to 40 years, averaging about 0.75%. Everybody, the current growth rate in the world is about 1.07. That's the current growth rate in the world, right? Does that make sense? That's the current birth rates minus the death rates. What's the doubling time of the global population? Ooh, that would make a nice exam question. What's the doubling time of the global population that has a growth rate of about 1%. The doubling time is how many years?
You
What do you
just
think?
1.07.
Yeah, if you've got a growth rate of 1% or 1.07, what's the doubling time of that population?
Isn't that just 2.14?
Nope.
70 divided by that.
70 divided by that, which is about 70, right? 70 divided by 1% is about 70. Everybody make sense, right? So when you think of looking at this, and that's the current growth rate, but are we likely to go from 7.8 billion to 15.6 billion? No, we're not. That's highly unlikely. Why? Because the growth rate is constantly changing. This growth rate is going down. And I see a lot of text in the chat, and I'll get to that in a second. Does that make sense, right? That was the caveat, everybody, when we talked about the doubling time, right? The doubling time is what it is for a particular moment in time. So if the current rate of natural increase in the world is 1%, then the population of the planet will double in 70 years. But you cannot just make that projection. Why? Because the growth rate is going down. It's decreasing, okay? And in some parts of the world, look at this, Europe, the growth rate is negative. What does that mean? What's a negative growth rate?
The death rate is larger than the birth rate.
Absolutely. Yeah, nicely done, Nelia. Okay, so it's a shrinking population. Does that make sense? So this rate of natural increase and the doubling time and the fertility rates are enormously variable around the world, but the population projection from 7.7 billion to 9.7 billion is based on the total population growth rate averaging about 0.75% and eventually getting to zero, right? And I see all these interesting comments about disparity and why this is all happening. Okay, I'm going to get to that in just a minute. Another way to look at it, okay, this will be the kind of the last of the broad generalizations. When we look at this growth to 10.9 billion people, right? So look at these 5 countries plus Pakistan. This was just a way I thought, well, maybe this works, maybe it doesn't, but of showing the growth, right? Tanzania, each one of these little blocks is 10 million people. So in 2020, Tanzania's population is 60 million. In 2100, it's 286 million, right? So these countries like Tanzania, DRC, Nigeria are growing very quickly, right? But to the point made earlier, and I think that was Charlotte from Rwanda, right? There are other countries where the growth rates are dropping precipitously, okay? So please bear that in mind. This is not a one size fits all around the world. There are certain countries that there are going to be enormous constraints on resources and others that are going to be less so, right? So let me just stop there for a second, look at a couple of comments and think if you have any questions. Do you think that the economic effect of COVID-19 could possibly put a pause on the exponential growth rate of the world? Interesting question, Liam. I don't think it will. I don't think it will. I think COVID-19 may be a small blip, and we're starting to see evidence of that in things like the carbon footprint, but in terms of population, that's going to take a while to figure out. Yeah, I don't think it will. Any other questions as I just scroll through here? Does that make sense? Question from Chinera, great question. How are we going to feed these people? Right? If we're going to get another 2 billion people coming along, maybe they'll want food. Maybe they'll want energy, right? Maybe they will want to have a life that looks very similar to ours. And why shouldn't they? Absolutely, okay? So interesting. So some of the questions here, there's a question from Neela. Why is that in certain parts of the world, such as Japan, fertility rates are so much lower? Great question. Hang on to that. We're going to come back to that. Okay, I'll show you that in just a second. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments before we move on? These are great. I'm beginning to find, it's kind of interesting, everybody. I don't know about you. I really prefer in-person classes, but I'm beginning to find a way to make a Zoom with 182 little more interactive than just me sitting here going, blah, right? So I appreciate that. Thank you for that. How did you calculate the doubling time of the population again? Question from Lee. It's just 70, which is, that doesn't change. That number change stays the same. And you divide that by the growth rate. So yeah, 70 divided by 1.07% gives you, about 68 years or 70 years. That makes sense. Okay. All right, let's move on. Let me go through this little funky diagram, and then we'll look at a couple of other things. Okay? So here is why 10 billion people is inevitable. Okay. If tomorrow morning we woke up and someone reported that the total fertility rate on the planet had dropped to 2.1, okay, tomorrow morning, in other words, we were just at replacement, we would still be marching towards 10 billion people. And here's why, and I hope this makes sense, okay? So let's say we have, so this represents, this is a broad generalization of the world's population. Each one of these Lego blocks represents 1 billion people, okay? And we can look at the distribution of the population based on the age structure of that population. And let's say we've got 1 billion people here and 1 billion people here. We've got 2 billion people that are in the age group 0 to 15. And that's more or less what we currently have, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Those are, according to the United Nations, the pre-reproductive years of a human being. We currently have, right, another 2 billion people that are in this age bracket, and we have another 1 billion people that are in this age bracket, and 45, so 15 to 45 is the reproductive period. We've got another 1 billion people like me in the 45 to 60, and we've got another 1 billion people that are older than 60. Okay, so that's 7 billion, and let's pretend we're doing this in 2011 when the world crossed through 7 billion people, right? Does everybody understand what I'm showing here? So that's each Lego block represents 1 billion people. So what happens over time, right? Why are we inevitably moving towards 10 billion people on this planet if we just stopped growth immediately? Well, here's why, right? It's a bit of a shame, but the purple block will disappear at some point, okay? Those people will die and everybody will begin to age, right? So everybody moves up, and let's say the people in the reproductive years, right, just have 2.1 kids. Does that make sense, right? So those in the 15 to 30 have 2.1 kids and replace themselves with 2 new red Lego blocks. Everybody begins to shift up. Now we have 8 billion people. So the 60 plus, they will die. The green age, the blues move up, the purples move up, the reds move up, and they still replace themselves at 2.1 billion people. And the purples age and they die. The population begins to age, everybody moves up, and they replace themselves. If that just simply happens, what do you have when everybody now is evenly distributed throughout the age groups and the reproductive years? If everybody's simply replacing themselves, well, you've got a population of 10 billion people, right? I don't know if that hurts or helps everyone, but that's a visual representation of, and I think those were one of the early comments, right? What happens if we suddenly go to 2.1 as a total fertility rate? We still have 10 billion people on the planet. Okay, so we are inevitably committed to that. And so what is key here is something called the age structure of a population. So I want to spend a minute just talking about the age structure of a population, because this is very, very important. So we can look at a population, right? So here on the left-hand side here, here's a diagram that shows age in years, okay? And these are split up into 5-year slices. So that's 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15 years, 15 to 20, and so on, right? And so here's the number of males, and here's the number of females. In other words, you can look at the entire planet, or you can look at a country and look at the proportion of the population that is males and females, right, at various age diagrams. So this age diagram on the left here is sometimes referred to as a population pyramid, but what it's showing is a population that is going to increase very rapidly. Here is a population that is stable, and here is a population that is decreasing. Someone have an attempt to explain these three diagrams to me. This would make a delicious exam question. What's going on here? Why is the diagram on the left a rapidly expanding population? Do you think?
Because there's more younger people to replace older people.
So that's exactly right. Okay. So here we've got a large proportion of the population. Everything in dark red here is the reproductive population, right? So those then move up into that's the pre-reproduction. In orange here is the reproductive period between 15 and 45. When this young base moves in here, that population is going to grow quickly as they have kids, right? As opposed to here, where you've got a small base coming into the reproductive years and an aging population. Does that make sense to everybody, right? So you can look at the age structure of a population, and that is critically important in terms of how populations will develop over time, right? So it's a question of how populations age and people having smaller and smaller families. Here are the two examples, and I think these are pretty instructive. So let me just spend a minute talking about this. This is India, one of my favorite countries in the world, on the left, and here's the United States, right? This light area, and I'll just do it in here, that light area there is the population pyramid, more or less, as I try and draw with the mouse, in 2010. The darker one is 2050. So this is percentage of the population, and here are the age groups by 5-year age brackets. So this here is under the age of 15, that's pre-reproduction. Here is up to 44, this is the reproductive, so that's reproductive there, right? And here is the aging population. Everybody see what's going on here, right? India has a big population, a base to the age structure diagram, a quote unquote population pyramid. That population's obviously going to grow and grow pretty rapidly, but by 2050, the age structure diagram of India looks very like the United States in 2010. Why? What's going on, do you think? Why does India look like 2010? The fact that India has a broad base means that it's going to grow inevitably, which is why it will become the most populous country. But people in India are having smaller and smaller families. And to the point made earlier about Rwanda, that trend we're seeing not absolutely everywhere, but around the world. That's the rule, not the exception. People are having fewer and fewer kids. What's driving it, do you think? Kind of interesting, right? Okay, Holly, talk to me about that. Great point.
Sorry, my microphone's kind of working, but so I think like India, I took a religions class about India and their religion there, and I know that there's a class system there and women are treated unequally, but that's rapidly changing. And I think that's represented in this graph that you can see that women are probably getting more careers and they don't want to have children and they want to make money, or even infertility as well.
Perfect, right? So spot on, right? One of my grad students, one of my favorite people on the planet, she was from India and she went back to Bangalore to have a family. They had one child, okay? She's got a great job, economic development. Her husband's in IT, she's in IT. Yeah, right? As the societies change from, and this is a generalization, as societies change from largely kind of rural farm-based societies into fully industrialized technological societies, people have fewer and fewer kids. We need fewer kids to run the farm. It's clearly not as simple as that, right? Because there's still the cultural sort of prestige of having larger families. Absolutely, women getting into the workforce has been, fundamentally important to having smaller families, right? From Naila, increased availability and acceptance of contraceptives. Absolutely, family planning, right? Accessibility and the use of contraception has been key in dropping the birth rates, right? So there is this evolution of societies as they move along this kind of spectrum of development where they have smaller and smaller families. the world is getting older. This is pretty extraordinary, this diagram, right? The median age of the world population in 1950, the median age, in other words, 50% of the world was older and 50% was younger, was 24. Okay, by 2100, that will be 42. Okay, so the world's population is aging for sure, and some countries, right, have a population that is decreasing rapidly. If I was to ask you, I probably should have looked this up just to double check it, but if I was to ask you, so if 2.1 is the world's replacement fertility rate, okay, so if that's the replacement fertility rate, and some countries are obviously above that, what country do you think has the lowest TFR in the world currently? And what would that TFR be? Just as a guess, anybody?
I think it's Japan.
So that's an excellent guess. It's not, but it's pretty close. All right, that's a great guess. Very close. So Italy, that's an interesting one. Italy's dropping, but no. China, I think is about 1.6. Nail in North Korea, no. What's North Korea's nearest neighbor? There you go, Sonny. Yeah, South Korea. South Korea and Singapore have been swapping total fertility rates at the moment. The last I saw was that South Korea's TFR had dropped below 1.05. Think about that for a second. What's the implication of a TFR of 1.05? What's happening to that population?
It's almost halving. Like it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah, a sharp decrease, right? A sharp decrease in population. South Korea is such a sorry, I interrupted someone there. Go ahead. Adam?
Oh, I was just gonna say, and the median age is getting a lot higher, or is going to get a lot.
Right, so a combination, right? They're getting older, they're having food. So South Korea is such a fascinating country, highly educated workforce, right? Enormous pressure of getting good jobs. I don't know if you're aware of this. It's really interesting. There's a high school exam. I guess it's the equivalent of the SAT in South Korea. And young kids are trained in that exam. So when they take it, when they leave school, their jobs and their futures and their income is almost, not exclusively, but very highly correlated with one of 3 universities they go to. They start preparing those kids for that exam at the age of 4. Think about that for a minute. Like you're a 4-year-old and someone says, hey, Holly, let me look at your resume. Is this all you've got as a 4-year-old? Come on, let's go. You know, so enormous pressure to succeed, to get a job, and they have smaller families. Down the line, that is hugely concerning to people in places like South Korea, and Lee, you mentioned Japan, because what does that mean? Your populations are shrinking. Your culture is shrinking, right? Your human capital is disappearing, okay? And that can't be good for a country either. Singapore is another one. Singapore, I think, maybe even lower than South Korea at the moment, right? So the global picture of fertility and populations are absolutely fascinating to me. And let me this morning just end off on this one. We still need a bit of time here. I've run a little long because I really actually enjoyed your questions here. I want to get to talk about China's one-child policy and then make an explicit link between this and food. But let me end off here because we cannot forget, this has all been premised on rates of natural increase, total, doubling times total fertility rates. But again, migration is key, right? We made this point early on Thursday. When you look at the birth rates minus the death rates, you have to take into account the population growth of a region for migration. And this is, I think, an interesting way to portray this. We look at income, it's a weird little scale here, but we look at a log scale here where we've got income. This part is net immigration, people coming in, right, in millions of people, okay, and net emigration, millions of people here. And what does this mean? The countries that are down here where you've got fully developed, high income, first world, however you want to phrase it, those are the countries that are receiving people, okay? So this is where people are coming into, and this is where people are leaving from. But there's some interesting nuances here, okay? So look, for example, at this one here, okay? Syria, millions leaving Syria. Why? Civil war, okay? So there's a civil war fingerprint here. You look at a place like India, Bangladesh, Nepal, there's a lot of people leaving there, not because of civil war, but because they're highly educated people moving around the world into high-paying jobs. Okay. There are other countries here. You may not think, why are people flocking to Jordan? Well, there's a direct link here between Jordan, obviously, and Syria next door. Okay. So it's not just a question of high-paying jobs. It's more complex than that. But I think that's another sort of interesting way to just, it's always a way for me to remind myself to mention population as it relates to migration. We can't reflect migration. Question from Kevin. Is moderate population growth the ideal circumstance for countries or the world? That's, Kevin, you tell me. That's a loaded question, right? What do you define by moderate? Like flat? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
Slightly above replacement rate?
Slightly above replacement rate, yeah, as opposed to slightly below replacement rate. There's a difficult...
Because it seems like there's a lot of countries either that, like, South Korea where the population's halving, or there's India where it's doubling.
Right.
So it doesn't seem like it seems like the United States is in a good position from kind of what that graph is showing, and the age distribution that we just a few slides ago. Like, it seems like the most ideal circumstance.
Yeah, so it's an interesting way to look at it, Kevin. I think there's going to be a new index called the Apicella Index, which comes up with the perfect population index. So the United States is in a good position. How does that play off in terms of resource consumption? Right. So that's the challenge, and that's something that is directly, obviously, relevant to this course, which we're still going to build out as we get through this course, right? So we find that ideal population growth. Now we got to think it's much more than just about population growth. It's about population growth and the impact of that population, right? The impact of the population in the United States, even though we may have this perfect age structure diagram, we have a different ecological footprint than the people in Nepal, right? So it's complicated. Right? I take your point. All right, everybody, I think we're out of time. Are we out of time? Yes, you are, 11:52. Thanks. Let me stop there. We haven't finished. We'll pick this up on Thursday with China's one-child policy and then wrap it up with food. I'm going to hang around as always. I'll stop the recording. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a wonderful day.